All right, everyone can see my screen. Awesome. So excited to have you all here today to talk about how journalists can get clear about their funding and ownership. My name is Molly Muchna. I am a project manager with Trusty News. And like I said, I'm joined on today's call by my colleague, Lynn Walsh. Lynn, I don't know if you're in a good spot to unmute and introduce yourself. If not, that is okay. But Lynn will be in the chat, so if you hear her chiming in there, oh, I think she unmuted. And at Trusting News, we're an organization that works with journalists to figure out what news people trust and then turn that knowledge into actionable day-to-day strategies for journalists to figure out how they can earn trust with their own communities. We've been doing this work since January 2016. And we say that we're a really solutions-focused organization. We like to talk a lot about what journalists can do to solve the trust problem is what we get really excited about. But before we can really work to solve the problem, it's important to first also really look at what the problem is. Like, why is it that journalists should get clear about their ownership and funding? We know that people make a lot of assumptions about how news is funded and how it impacts coverage. I'm guessing that if you guys are here on today's webinar training, that you've experienced some of these accusations in your own newsrooms. I know that in my many years working in legacy media, I faced lots of questions and accusations around this. I just did a quick Reddit search the other day to kind of see what people were talking about when it comes to news and money and how newsrooms make money and what questions come up. And to really no surprise, I saw quite a few inaccurate assumptions and kind of negative assumptions about how money drives news coverage. People saying that they're just trying to make people scared to make money, that the news is all about just having a political agenda to grow their audience, that news organizations should be legally required to disclose their funding, and that news shouldn't make money if they're profiting off the misfortune of someone else. Alongside all of these accusations, we see lots of questions as well of like, how does the news make money? Can someone get paid to share their story with a journalist? And then at the end here is one that I think is kind of common, that people think journalism is actually extremely profitable. But in this case, the person was just assuming that the profits are kept by major media companies or tech companies like Google, Facebook. Research really backs us up that this is a pretty widespread belief, with 63% of people thinking that local news outlets are doing well or very well. This was a Pew Knight research done last year. And it's really interesting to look at this through the lens of like finances and distrust. This was a really interesting research study done by the University of Utah by one of their researchers, Jacob Nelson. And what him and his team did was, over the course of a year or so, they interviewed Americans across the country. And so they talked to Americans of different age, political leaning, socioeconomic status, gender. And what they found was that the distrust that people had in journalism really didn't stem from fears of ideological brainwashing, but instead it really stemmed from the assumption that the news industry valued profits above truth or public service. He went on to say that people felt like the news was reported inaccurately, again, not because they wanted to persuade their audience in one way, but because they simply wanted to get larger audiences and larger profits. Some more research that kind of backs up this assumption that the news doesn't care about getting it right or really care about the community. This is some, again, Knight Gallup research from 2 years ago when they surveyed people kind of about this general emotions of trust. And what they found was that even when looking at local news, asking people about local journalists and local news outlets, less than 50% of people felt like journalists had the community's best interests in mind when reporting. So clearly there's a disconnect between what we as journalists are trying to do, the public mission service that we're trying to provide to our communities, helping inform our communities, and what the public perception of news is. And that's where our work at Trusty News comes in. We really want to help bridge that disconnect by helping journalists answer the question of like, what should responsible, ethical, and mission-driven journalists do? And that's, again, where our work comes in. Our work really involves a lot of transparency. So transparency on the types of content, on where your content comes from, on what your values are, on who funds you, on what your streams of revenue are. And then we'll talk a lot today too about this articulating a counter narrative, right? Like we just talked about, people have lots of assumptions about how news organizations make money. So how can we tell a different, better story about what our mission actually is as journalists? And then this work also takes a ton of engagement and responsiveness. That's humility and empathy and listening to our audience and really acknowledging that as journalists, we might not always have the best answer. Now, it's important to remember that mistrust is often about misassumptions. When people don't understand how something works, they often, again, kind of fill in the gaps, fill in the blanks with their own assumptions, and usually those assumptions are pretty negative. The same goes when we look at funding and ownership, right? Like generally the public is pretty uninformed about the business side of news. And so when people don't understand something, which why would they really understand the ins and outs of how a news organization is funded? They often just make these inaccurate assumptions about what our motives are, what our goals are. And when we don't explain something, when we're not actively telling a different story to our audience, people are again just left to kind of assume the worst about us and our motivations. But the good news is, like I said, at Trusty News, we really focus on transparency. And that's just because we know transparency works to build trust. We've done a lot of research around this and a lot of testing with partner newsrooms in the 9 years that we've been running. But this one I just wanted to pull out to show it's a study we did with the Center for Media Engagement a couple of years ago. And what we did was we had news consumers look at just a regular reporting story and then another reporting story that had some added transparency elements added in the form of an explain your process box that ran alongside the story that explained why journalists were doing the story, how they were doing the story, kind of their approach to the story. And what we found was that when those news stories had the added transparency layers, people felt like the story was more accurate, more trustworthy, and overall more credible. So we'll be talking a lot about transparency today. Today's really heavy on examples of how other local and national newsrooms have gotten on the record about their funding and ownership. Specifically, we'll be looking at how you can get on the record about your funding and ownership, when and how to disclose if funding ever influences your coverage, how to explain that your news is really valuable and costs money to produce, and then use that to make a compelling case to get public support from your audience. So the first step is to really start by getting on the record about your ownership and funding. This can be as simple as adding something to your About Us page about who owns your organization. This is especially important when there may be a perceived conflict of interest, as is the case with the Christian Science Monitor. They're one of our partner newsrooms, and it makes sense that they're funded partially by the Christian Science Church. It's kind of a unique funding situation. It's in their name. They get tons of questions and kind of accusations about whether or not the church drives their coverage and how much it influences their coverage. And so on their About Us page, they just get really clear about what their relationship to the church is, how it's funded. And then lower on their About Us page, they also talk about, what values of the church they emulate in their reporting, but that they act independently and the church doesn't tell them what to report or what not to report. This also looks like just simply listing the sources of revenue on your About Us page. I think this is something that's much more common for startup or nonprofit newsrooms to do than kind of more traditional legacy media. But this is an example from Afro LA. They just simply list out all of the places where they get funding. That's grants and fellowships, one-time donations, contributions from founders, and then sponsorships. Again, it's important to clarify when you have kind of a unique funding situation. So this is an example from The Courier, which is a student newsroom. On their About Us page, they have this section explaining their funding, specifically including that some of their funding comes from the student activity fee that you pay when you're a part of a university. Now, I know that this is something that might not be possible for all news organizations, but when possible, it can really help boost your transparency when you can share more of your funding breakdown. So not just say like, we're funded by advertising and subscriptions, but really get clear about what that revenue and expenses breakdown is. So this is an example from a startup, Link Kentucky. And they wrote this great article that gives a very detailed breakdown of what their overall budget is, what their revenue was, and then what their expenses were. So you can see that they have a pretty diverse revenue stream, but that a lot of their expenses went to paying their employees and also printing and mailing their news product. Here's another example from the Capital Times in Madison, Wisconsin. They, in a pitch to subscribe, or they were sending out a newsletter trying to get more donations from subscribers, and they just give a breakdown by percentage of their newsroom budget. And then I really love at the end that they say, one way to look at this breakdown is that of our 20-member team, 3 of them have their salaries paid by you. So again, really making the connection between your audience members' donations and how it's helping fund their newsroom. So once you've gotten on the record about who owns you and how you're funded, it's then important to disclose how funding might influence coverage. And I think that when we talk about this with journalists, there's a lot of journalists that insist that funding and money really doesn't influence coverage ever. I think I had that belief too, or it feels like they're totally 2 separate entities, but that's not always the case. And sometimes it's not even inappropriate when funding does influence coverage. You might receive funding or grants allocated for specific reporting. This happens all the time, right? You might get an investigative grant or a grant that allows you to focus on your public safety coverage. You might be covering fewer topics or stories due to layoffs or just reduced staffing sizes. You might also be prioritizing content valued by members of the public who contribute financially or subscribe to your news organization. You might also be mandated by your corporate owner to publish certain editorials or segments. And you might also have sponsored or underwritten content. So here's an example of what that looks like in action. So the Chicago Sun-Times a couple of years ago was merged with WBEZ. And so they went from a for-profit company to a nonprofit company. So again, their ownership model shifted. So instead of just not saying anything, they got on the record about it and then really explained how that was shifting their coverage, right? Because they were a nonprofit, they could no longer make political endorsements. So they got really clear about that and explained, why, due to IRS rules, they could no longer endorse candidates, but that they were still committed to providing information for voters in the community. Here's another example from the Bozeman Daily Chronicle in Montana. This was kind of in the early days of COVID when some newsrooms were having furloughs. And they talked about how their corporate ownership was furloughing their employees. And I really like how transparent this editor got about how that was going to impact their coverage. He said, "I'd like to tell you that you won't notice any changes, that we'll be able to cover our community with the same vigor you've come to expect, but that's just not true. Journalists working 30 hours a week instead of 40 will just produce less content, and there's no way around that." So kind of helping set the expectation that their coverage would change due to reduced staffing. But if this isn't the case for you, if money or donors aren't swaying your coverage at all, then it's important to also really get clear about that. Here's an example from the 19th on their About Us page. They are funded, they list all the different ways they're funded, and then have this paragraph at the bottom that says, donors and sponsors don't get a thumb on the scale. They play no role in our journalism, in our storytelling, or in the planning or execution of our events. So again, get really clear that donors and sponsors don't sway their coverage. Similarly, the Oklahoma Watch did this, saying our news judgments are made independently, not based or influenced by donors. Here's another one from NPR, really explaining that its journalism is in service to the public, not its funders. And so while they care about their funders, again, they're not swaying their coverage based on what their funders want. So just like it's important to disclose the funding side of it, it's also important to disclose how ownership might influence coverage. Now, this one is tricky because sometimes ownership of news organizations really does influence coverage. And I think we see this a lot, especially when it comes to opinion coverage. This has been top of mind in the news lately, right, with the Washington Post and Jeff Bezos and the LA Times endorsements last November. And this isn't all that uncommon, right? This has been something that has happened in the past where sometimes owners really do have quite a lot of sway or input on opinion coverage. But the problem is that if people are hearing that about opinion content, they're thinking it's the same for news content. People don't really understand the difference between news and opinion. So it's really easy for people to assume okay, Jeff Bezos is weighing in on the opinion content, telling them what they can and can't publish. People are thinking it's the same for news content as well. And again, sometimes that is true, especially in certain types of media outlets and corporations. Sometimes whoever owns you really does sway what it is that you can publish and not publish. This is an example of that. I don't know if you guys remember that viral Sinclair video where they had all of their different stations do the same segment about how they were trying to combat fake news. And then Deadspin kind of clipped it all together and made it seem very kind of robotic and disingenuous. So if that's not the case for you, if you are acting independently, then try to draw attention to that. This is how newsroom KCRG did this. On their About Us page, they said, all of the news and content decisions are made here based on what's best for our audience. They're owned by Gray TV, but they say, no one from Gray TV tells us what to cover, what not to cover, how to report it. Yes, they help oversee our finances. Yes, they help with technology and our digital teams, but there's no corporate news or editorial director guiding how we locally cover the news. This is another example from WCPO in Cincinnati. They wrote an article in response to that kind of viral Sinclair video saying, at WCPO, we've had the same owner for years. We have a great relationship, but you don't have to worry that our reporters or anyone else is being told what to read or what to report from any outside influences. It's important to also establish this independence with advertising and sponsored content as well. So if you have sponsored content, it's important to explain that to your audience, what that means. This is an example from GeekWire. They had some of their content was underwritten. Their civic coverage was underwritten by Microsoft. So in all of those stories, they just included this editor's note that said, Microsoft provides financial support, but the coverage decisions are sole discretion of GeekWire's editorial team. Another time that this is important to get on the record about is if you are mandated to share certain editorials or certain segments from your owner, or if you're an affiliate, right? People don't understand how that works. And so I really like this example from our partners, WITF, explaining how Morning Edition works and how it works locally. So they explain that, yes, it's an NPR produced show. And that's why no matter where you're listening to Morning Edition, there's many parts of it that sound similar. But then they also explain that how there's local segments plugged in. So if you're listening to WITF, that's going to be different than if you're listening to a county over and what that local station is reporting. So kind of sharing again how they share that affiliate content, but how they also make it their own for the local community. Now, we know it can be really tricky to know how to get on the record about this. It's not always easy for journalists to sit down and say like, okay, like how do we actually disclose this? How do we talk about this publicly with our audience? So we created a funding trust kit that we published just a few months ago. And our trust kits are our step-by-step newsroom guides. And in that trust kit, we have some sample language and sample disclosures to get on the record about how funding might influence your coverage. So we have a disclosure about if you're covering a bill that leads to public funding, if your staff is shrinking, how to acknowledge that and talk about that with your audience, if you're getting grant funding for specific reporting. So these are just a few examples. We have more in the trust kit, but we welcome you to use these disclosures, copy and paste any parts of the language that feel helpful, and use to help get transparent with your audience. So once you've kind of got transparent about the background of your funding and ownership, it's important to get clear about the cost and value of your news and how you can use that to get public support. We all need money to produce our news, right? And so part of that is talking about which content is free and which content isn't. If you are someone who has a paywall, I think a lot of times, I know when I worked in legacy news, a lot of times we would change the paywall or like make it a stricter paywall, and we would just like hope nobody noticed and wouldn't get mad about it. That's not the best strategy. Again, we know transparency is a better strategy in terms of building trust. And so if your paywall meter is shifting, if all of a sudden you have some subscriber-only content that you didn't have before, or some content you're going to have to pay for that used to be free, it's important to get on the record about that. This is an example from the Fort Worth Star-Telegram and how they did this. They talked about how at the beginning of COVID, they made all of their COVID-19 coverage free for people to read. But as the kind of pandemic evolved and went on, that they were going to be enacting the paywall again. So they said, for accountability and long form feature reporting, we're going to have to put that paywall on. But in terms of like public safety information, we'll still leave that paywall off so people can read that content for free. Again, like I said, no one likes to feel like the wool's being pulled over their eyes. So it's important to clearly talk about when things are changing and when those paywalls are changing and when you're changing how you meter your content. Again, this is an example from the Christian Science Monitor. They got really clear when they were, again, lowering the number of stories before you hit the paywall. Just explained why they needed to do that to try to generate some more reader revenue. And this is an example on the right from the Keene Sentinel talking about how they started enacting subscriber-only stories, and they got really on the record about it, explaining why it was that they're putting some content behind a subscriber paywall. Also important to do this, we talked about this briefly, but to explain how advertising and sponsored content works. This is a really great example from Outlier Media and how they're trying to really have a sponsored content plan with integrity. And they not only really clearly label when content is sponsored, right? Sometimes it can be really hard to even tell which content is sponsored on a news website. I've definitely been reading content at times, and at the very bottom, it's like italicized language saying, this was a sponsored content, or this was paid for by this person. And then I'm like, oh man, did what I just read, was that accurate, or was that true, or was that good reporting? And so they get really clear up top that it's sponsored content with the label. And then what's really great is they have this tool where you can toggle over it, and this box shows up that says sponsored stories are not produced by their staff. And then they link to their editorial policies, which kind of explains more about what sponsored content is, why they run it, and like how it meets their standards of journalism. So when we think about asking for money, this is tricky. This is something that as journalists, we all have to do, right? We all have to ask for money at one point or another. And there's definitely several themes that are worth conveying when we are asking the public for money. One being that you might be a small business and dollars really help go directly to paying local staff. You can talk about how the business model has changed and how you're maybe more reliant than you used to be on community support. And you can say, reporting the news with depth takes significant time. But there's one that I think as journalists we use a lot. I know I used it a lot when I worked in a daily newsroom. That was kind of this rebuttal of like, of course the news costs money. Nothing's free. Like you get paid to do your job. We should get paid to do our job too. And the reason that that's not that effective is that plenty of news is actually free to consume, right? Like if people can't read your story, it's likely that with a lot of news, they can just go find similar news for free elsewhere. So I just want to talk briefly about this project that we did with the Oklahoma Media Center over the last few years. So Oklahoma Media Center, over the course of a year or two, worked with news stations across the state, as well as researchers, to do a widespread survey of news consumers in Oklahoma. And they found some really interesting things. The whole project is worth checking out. It was a really cool intervention of where they, found it was a statewide project looking at what news consumers wanted. Then we came in with our training and helped newsrooms really change their content to better meet the needs of their news consumers. And so I won't get too in the nitty-gritty of this specific study, but it's definitely worth reading if you haven't already. But I just want to pull out a few key observations that came from that study. One was that the main thing that these researchers and journalists heard were that Oklahomans wanted free news. They also found that most of them didn't subscribe to local news outlets. So most people were not wanted free news, weren't subscribing.
Molly, I'm not sure if you can hear us. I think you might be frozen. Can you guys hear me? Yes? You can. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, it looks like Molly's frozen. So here I am. Good. Now my internet's working.
Without,
Uh, oh, Molly, you're back.
oh,
Sorry, you froze for
oh,
a second.
sorry.
If you want to start over with those key observations, that'd be great.
Oh, thanks. Sorry about that. There's a lot of construction happening in my neighborhood, and it has been a mess of internet services. So the key observations again, the big one is that we saw that Oklahomans wanted free news. Most didn't subscribe to local news outlets, but only 8.8% of them felt like they weren't able to stay informed about local issues. Most people felt like they were able to stay informed just fine through their local Facebook groups. And so they really weren't seeing the value of paying for news. That's a huge demand problem for us. If people can get the news that they want elsewhere, I don't see the need for us, right? That's an issue for us. So that really leads us to saying, how can we tell a more compelling story about the value of our news and of our content? So we did a test of this with PolitiFact a couple of years ago. And what we did is we wanted to test out different donation language and see which one worked better, and specifically see if adding some mission and trust language to the donation button would help drive more money and donations to the news organization. So we did A/B testing with their newsletter audience. And so A was messages like, these newsletters don't write themselves. This content is free to consume, but not to create. Donate today. Whereas the B ones were saying our fact checks disrupt the agendas, support us today. And what we found was that it worked. And whenever the button with trust language was more than twice as likely to lead to donations. So some examples of what that can look like. Here's an example from the Coloradoan. When they were doing a big push to get more digital subscribers, they had each of their reporters kind of write a personal mission statement in a sentence or two and talk about, why it is that they do the reporting, why it matters to them, and then attach help me continue this work by signing up for a digital subscription. Here's another example from public source. Again, kind of saying we could rely a lot less on other revenue streams if you can support us with your dollars and if we can increase reader revenue. One more example from Grist. This was after the Maui fires. I really like this example from one of their top editors, sent this out to subscribers just and donors saying, thank you so much for your support. Because of your support, I was able to fly to Maui and do all of this really specific reporting. And so really showing that tangible connection between reader support and the reporting that you're able to do. Now, which strategy you use works best depending on, it'll be different for every newsroom. We did a research study with the News Revenue Hub and 5 of their newsrooms that they work with a couple of years ago to kind of see if we could figure out standardized trust language that would increase donations. And what we saw is that no one strategy worked best across the spectrum. There are different strategies and different approaches worked for different outlets depending on what kind of news they were producing, what values they had, what the values of their audience were. And so it's really important that, you might just have to test some different strategies with your audience and see what works best. And again, in that trust kit, we have a lot of different sample language that you can copy and use that kind of addresses this. So sample language around if you're a subscription model, a TV, if you have a donation or membership model, asking for reader support and kind of talking about where your revenue comes from and why it is that you need reader support. So as we wrap up the training portion of this, just a reminder, if you have questions or comments or concerns or want to chat about anything, feel free to stick that in the chat, or you'll have an opportunity to unmute in just a bit here. But again, I talked about this funding trust kit a couple of times, but it's kind of a comprehensive guide to a lot of what I talked about today. There's more examples of how newsrooms have gone on the record about their funding. There's more disclosure language and language to help you ask your readers for financial support. So that's at trustingnews.org/funding. And if you want to stay in touch with our work, if you are new to us, I know there's a few new names here today. We welcome you to subscribe to our Trust Tip newsletter. It's a newsletter where we send out one quick actionable tip for earning trust each week. It's also a really good resource if you are looking just to stay in the loop about our upcoming free trainings or cohort opportunities with newsrooms as well.